Well, hello again, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this special podcast. This is an interview about the history of Calvary Baptist here in Gaylord. And I'm joined by Sherry Johnson. Um, Sherry, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I have a hunch that you are one of the people who has been here the longest.
Well, pretty much, probably. And greetings to everyone.
We're recording this in the fellowship room in the back of the church, which is probably why you hear a little bit more echo and reverb in the background. We're doing that so that we can sit on opposite sides of the table and still socially distance, because we are recording this at the end of May 2020. And with a podcast like this about some of the history of the church, this will probably be kept in the archives for some time. And so anybody in the future that hears this was during the time of the coronavirus issue, and we are just starting to meet back together physically, and we've had to make a lot of adaptives during this time. So Sherry, what I wanted to do is talk to you about how yourself and Doug started attending here at Calvary, when that was, and talk to us a little bit about what it was like then.
All right. Well, Doug and I were married in 71, and I come from a strong church background. I was raised in the Church of Christ in Kalkaska, and always went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, youth things, and even through college, I found a Church of Christ in Big Rapids at Ferris, where I went. And I would go to church there and met Doug and took him to church with me. And so after we were married, of course, church was a big part of my life. I wanted to get back into church. So his family was members of another church in town, and so I started going there. And I went every time they had church. Well, Doug would go with me and his family, but pretty soon they kind of got into their same habits of once in a while going to church. I was desiring something closer to my faith that I was raised in, more fundamental, I guess I can use that word.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I just started looking around. The Church of Christ in Gaylord does not use instruments, musical instruments. And I have a lot of love for the piano, the organ. I was in band, all those things. So that didn't really suit me. So I tried the Baptist church here in town. I had visited the Baptist church in Kalkaska with my girlfriends. So I was familiar with the way the service went, and it was a lot like the Church of Christ. We sang hymns and had preaching and a lot of youth activities. It was, something I was desiring. So I came, walked in the door, loved the people, and Doug started coming, and we just haven't left since. We've loved it here ever since.
So you started coming here which year?
It would be about 1973. It was a year before our daughter was born.
All right. Wow. That was my freshman year of high school.
You're trying to make me feel old.
And, as something we have in common is playing piano and organ, how did you mentioned how the Church of Christ didn't use instruments. For people that are listening, the Church of Christ in its original, the denomination, the Church of Christ, in its original founding, took the stance, they said, instruments are mentioned in the Old Testament in worship, but they're not specifically mentioned in the New Testament. And that was one of the reasons why all their music was a cappella singing. Now, there's another branch of the Church of Christ that does use instruments, and that's what you were raised in.
That's right.
But that being said, how did you get started with piano and then organ?
Well, that's interesting. I took piano as a child from an older lady in town, and I could walk to her house. And of course, with 6 kids, my mom couldn't run us everywhere, so this was very convenient. My sisters and I would walk there, and we had piano lessons. So I probably took from her for maybe 3 or 4 years, and then she passed away. So I didn't take any more training in piano until I got into high school. There was a need in our church for pianists, and so they asked me if I would be interested. And so there was a young lady there. Actually, she was just a grade ahead of me, but she had had a lot of formal training. She was terrific on the piano and the organ. So she taught me how to play hymns on the piano. I would go for lessons and gradually learn to play hymns, which are quite difficult, actually.
They are. I've known several really liturgical high organists and have said the toughest thing for them to play is the hymns, because you're looking at the hymnal, and what that really is a choral arrangement, and you have to extrapolate on site it into the keyboard parts.
Right. So then there was a need for an organist, and so she began to teach me organ. So that is all the training I ever had. And then, but I did play through my high school years for church services. Once I got married, Doug and I lived in a mobile home, no room for a piano, of course. Then the children came, and I was too busy to think about that or take time. I didn't touch a keyboard for 10 years. And then, of course, coming here to Calvary Baptist Church, again, there was a need for somebody to play the hymns, piano and organ. And so Pastor Flater actually came to our house, talked to Doug and I, and said, would you be willing, and, Doug, would it be okay with you? So that was a huge step for me. I was very rusty, and I was very, very nervous. So nervous that I would physically be ill every Sunday morning. But I stuck it out, and eventually the nerves eased up, and it just became a real love and a real ministry of mine.
Oh, yeah. Well, I understand what it's like to be rusty. When Terry and I first came here, the first year or so, I wasn't playing piano, and then when I started to, I was rusty. If it was the hymns I was familiar with, it was no big deal, but just different churches have different hymns they tend to gravitate to, and over the last few years we've tried to expand that a bit, but still they're largely speaking very traditional hymns, and some of them just don't fall into the fingers as well. I keep saying that I think that the keys on the piano are shrinking because I hit more than one at the same time. Now, you had mentioned a name, Pastor Flater, and I have in front of me the kind of the historical book of the church. And something that many people don't realize is that the church was actually founded officially in 1954. And at the time, and for its first 15 years of existence, it was an affiliate of the Michigan chapter of the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. And the first pastor that was called was a man named Malcolm Quick, and the location of the church wasn't here. It was over in the area of town that is only a couple of blocks away from the old high school, the now intermediate school.
Right.
And I think that building was converted into apartments. Am I right?
I believe so.
I'm not sure which building it is, but I know it's right in that general area. Not too far from the community center.
Right.
That stone building. And then Pastor Halter was called here in 1964, and he had served in Harbor Springs. And Ada's family knew him at the church in Harbor Springs. And he served here all the way until September 1977. And during that time, it was a good-sized church.
It was a very large church when I came here for this area in 1973. It would have been, the auditorium was full and the overflows were full. We set up chairs on both sides, and there were a lot of children here because I often would help Wednesday night with prayer meeting. We would sit and hear the scripture, and then the children would divide off, and we'd take them to the back room and do prayer requests and prayers with them. And it was a very large group of kids, 25 to 50 sometimes. So, yeah.
And when you talk about children, for one thing, the area that we know is the church office. I believe that was the nursery.
That was the nursery at one time, yes.
And those bulletin boards in front of it there, those were windows.
Right.
So you could see into the nursery. And there's another thing that changed, and I'm not sure when it did, and that was the hallway at the back of the church wasn't a hallway because the wall wasn't there.
So they could see from the nursery right into the whole auditorium there.
When was that wall added and those doors at the back of the church?
I believe it was when Pastor Harwood was here. He was very good at building, and so were his sons. And they converted that into his office, but he didn't want those huge windows looking in there. So the windows were then put on the dividing wall
Yes.
so that you can see into the hallway, and yet it was a noise barrier. It was basically for noise and distraction to
Well,
keep
sure.
the auditorium more quiet.
Anybody that was coming in a few minutes into the service, you would hear everything
Yes.
without that wall there. It also helped them to isolate the heating zones
Right.
a little better too. And there was another change that happened at some point. The front of the church didn't always look the way that it does now.
Oh,
And I think you were speaking about that. There used to be like a railing at the very front of the platform.
oh, you mean inside?
Inside,
Yes. There was a half wall, I guess you would say, all along the front of that, and the organ sat behind it, and the piano sat on the floor actually, and on the other side was the choir. We did have a choir during the Halter years.
Mm-hmm.
So, and some of the time during the Harwood years, we had a choir as well.
Now, those are the two names that I hear the most when I talk, not only to anybody who had been here years ago, but even to people who have lived in the community for years and have gone to other churches, but they knew of Calvary, and they talk about Pastor Halter and Pastor Harwood. But there were two gentlemen that served in between there. There was a 5-year period in between. Larry Thompson served here from September 77 until October 78. And I know very little about him other than his son, John Thompson, is one of Rusty Chatfield's colleagues at the church up at Burt Lake. And it's funny because his son said to me, I have a question for you. In the basement of the church, is there still carpeting on the poles in the basement? And I sort of laughed. I said, yes, there is. And he says, that's the only thing I remember about there. I can just envision him running around, and they put the carpeting on there just to kind of give some padding.
Padding and quiet those poles down, because kids see a pole, what do? They climb it and they bang on it.
Yeah,
And
that's
so,
true.
And that's always been our big area for our youth events. So,
Well, it's a lot of good space down there. Pastor Halter was here during the time when the building was constructed. And of course, last fall we just had our 50th anniversary of the building. Really, it's a building that has, it's laid out well. It looks a lot bigger than it appears to be. From the
Yes.
outside, it's kind of like somebody said it's kind of like the TARDIS on Doctor Who. It's bigger on the inside.
and there's different spaces all over the place, like upstairs, the
Those three-
prophet's chambers. That was then the nursery.
Okay.
That was a nursery for several years, and that has two attics, I guess you would call them.
Yeah,
Two side, and plus the flowers and decorations are stored up there in one side, and there's just all kinds of
Sure. There are
hidden
these
spaces.
3 classrooms right behind the baptistry.
Right.
And then there's the area we're sitting in right now that wasn't added until the 90s.
Yes, it was added for the school, for the Christian school. And then when Carol, what was her last name? Carol Corwin
Yes.
was the teacher for several years. And then when she got cancer, the school kind of ended. School years ended here.
That would have been in the early 90s, perhaps.
Yes, and
Right about then is when Otsego Christian got started. And I remember when I was with OCS, there were a number of books in the library there that were stamped Calvary Baptist Academy. So at some point, some of the books had apparently been donated.
Yes, been donated over there. And this area stayed as just a storage area for years, and accumulated a lot of stuff, as you can imagine. And then at one point we decided we needed to use the space. The downstairs was hard for people with physical challenges to get down there for our fellowships. That's where we had all our fellowships. It has a beautiful kitchen down there, and in fact the guys used to have wild game dinners, and we had all kinds of special events down there, but it became just too hard for people to get down to. And this was a beautiful space, so we cleaned it out and painted it and moved our fellowship area up here, and it's a lot more convenient to
Oh,
people.
yeah. Well, it's a good space, and now with the nursery right on the end of it there, it's a much larger space, and it's all on the main floor.
Right.
The school that was here I thought that it had started during Pastor Harwood's time, but I found out that it was here during Pastor Verlederer as well.
That was when they started it, and it was held in the lower level,
Yeah, it
in
was
the
in the
basement.
basement. And then the need to add this back here was at least in part driven by some fire exit requirements.
Right.
Some egress requirements. Now, you spoke about how it was much bigger back then. And of course, it was probably the only Baptist church in town.
It was, well, I believe the Baptist church out on at Seagull Lake
Okay, yes.
was in existence. That was a small church that served that area, that
Sure.
group of people. Pastor Porter.
Pastor Porta
Porta was
there for years. Harold, who is coming to us when he can get here now, and his wife went to that church.
Oh, did they? Okay. So yes, it was. It was a lot of people came here, but then the community began to change, and when Evangelical Free Church built and started up, some families, of course, moved there. Was that before Pastor Harwood?
Yes, that would have been late 70s.
Okay.
And they were in the church building that today is the Wisconsin Synod Lutheran Church. That's right in the older section of town.
Oh, okay.
And that's where E-Free got started. And one of their interim pastors for a while was Phil Chose. And Ruth was with him, one of the, working with all the teens.
Yes.
And they had a young teen in there named Jay Childs, who many years later was Terry's and my pastor at Midland E-Free Church. So, okay, it's a small world.
Yeah, it's a very small world.
I mean, and
isn't
there
it?
is this, generally speaking, the Evangelical Free Church is very Baptistic
Right.
in doctrine. And so there was a lot in common there, and it met and it filled an unmet need
Right.
in town. And as you said, towns change.
Right.
But things here at Calvary went along really just fine, and there were ups and downs, but generally it was a healthy church, and the pews were reasonably filled. And then in the 80s, things continued to change, but yet still the numbers stayed up there really well into the 90s.
Yes.
That's my understanding.
Yes.
Pastor Harwood retired actually he announced his retirement in 2003, but it took well over a year to find a successor, so he continued to fill in during that time. And then Pastor Jay Chambers, the record says, began here in October of 2004, and Jay served until actually May of 2015.
Yes.
And so that gives some of the background and the history here. What are some of the things that have changed over the years?
In the church itself here?
Now, well, we talked about the building. Let's talk about just the way that we do church, the services, the music. Some things don't change and shouldn't, and other things have to adapt. It's one of my mantras.
Right.
The message doesn't change, the method probably has to.
One thing in the morning service, I would say, is still pretty close to what it's always been, other than we had a lot of talented singers, and so if we didn't have a choir, we always had special music in the morning. We also had special music in the evening on Sunday evenings. At one point I became the special music coordinator, and I would ask the younger kids to sing, either teenagers, a lot of teenagers that enjoyed singing. It was a good training time for them, and then as they got better at it, then they would move to morning service. And I also twisted the arms of my kids. And my daughter, Kim, has a lovely voice. She started singing in the evening services, and then later began singing in the morning services. And once in a while we'd do a duet together. I did sing regularly, but I am an alto, so it always, with someone. And then just as time changes, families come and go. We just haven't had a real strong soprano to provide the special music, I guess you might say. We really, really enjoy your talents on the organ and the piano, and Terry's with the flute, and it's just a joy when you guys do provide special music for us. So we need to pray in some strong singers so we can again have some special music.
We really haven't just had anything like that for most of the time that I've been around here.
Right.
And it's hard to imagine that next month, well, at the end of June, the third Sunday in June marks the completion of 5 years.
Completion of 5 years.
It's just kind of hard to imagine.
Yeah.
Let's transition very briefly here to missions. The church has always had a priority for mission support. And while I keep emphasizing the importance of recognizing the local mission field, that doesn't in any way take away from the fact that we support missionaries to some faraway places. And yourself and Lois have been kind of the people that have been on that committee. And we were able to even add an additional missionary about 1.5 years ago.
Right. It's been 2 years now.
It has been 2 years,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. We've always had supported several missionaries and had a strong missionary-minded church. Pastor Harwood's daughter, Jennifer, married, and a fella that became a missionary, and so that was her heart's desire to be a missionary. And she asked her father, can I just be a missionary and go off on my own? And he said, well, let's pray about that. Maybe the Lord will provide you with a husband that has a desire to be a missionary. And of course, they're in the Ukraine now, have raised their family, and their kids are now getting married. But we had, at one point, our church got into some real financial difficulties, and that was under Pastor Jay Chambers. Well, when he came here, we were in that state, and he advised that we were going to have to drop our support for the missionaries and get our church in good financial condition, and then add those missionaries back one at a time. That was very, very difficult for both Lois and I to see that happen, but the Lord blessed that decision, and we've been able to add those missionaries back, and some of them we've been supporting for a long, long time.
Probably
like
20 years or so.
Yeah, like Craig Ledbetter and Ted Mullins for at least 20 years, maybe 30. So, yeah. So Lord bless, and now I think our church is in good, healthy financial situation, and our mission fund is in a very good, healthy situation. Praise the Lord for that.
We've been really blessed financially, and I mean it's a modest church budget, no question. But what we did is we made some decisions, some of them before I came to town, and some since. The corporate term at Dow Chemical was right sizing. We just adapted and just faced certain things, and the idea was maybe we can't do everything we used to do, so what can we do and still do it well?
Good philosophy.
Yeah, well, I think that's what we have to do in our own lives. One of the things that sometimes I think churches fall into this, and I know Christian schools fall into this, and that's they get into a mode in which they say, nope, God's spoken to me and he told me that we're going to do X and he'll provide. And the problem is that God really didn't speak to them. They spoke to themselves. And what they've basically done is acted irresponsibly, even though they think they're walking by faith.
Right.
And we have to be careful. We really have to be careful on that. I think we've been prudent with our finances, and people have been supportive. And even during the COVID-19 time here, we're doing well financially. Everything is running about, expenses and giving are about even. Obviously, we've reduced the expenses somewhat, but we didn't need some of those things because we weren't running some of those programs. Well, the thing that I would like to just conclude about is the idea that this is a church that's been through some times of some real heights and some times of some real lows, and you and Doug have been people who have just kind of ridden the roller coaster, ridden the wave through everything. I'm sure that there were points that you said to yourself, Lord, is it time for us to just look somewhere else? What kept you here? during those
Well,
difficult times?
You're absolutely right. There was a period I was on my knees asking the Lord um, if I could go somewhere else, that it was just hard. And He always just spoke to my heart about waiting on Him, persevering, sticking it out, trusting Him. He gave Doug and I both a piece about just staying here. And so that's what we did. We just were obedient. Anything that we could do to help the pastor, help the people in the church. There were times when there were angry people here, and they wanted to see us closed. But that, I just believe with the deepest part of me that that was not God's will. There is a reason why this church has stayed open. There's people that need this church, and it's God's ministry. It's not my ministry. It's not any pastor's ministry. It's God's ministry. People have needs, and sometimes we look and we say, oh, we're just, we're not growing by leaps and bounds. But my goodness, look at Noah. He stuck it out for how many years without a convert? Got on that ark with only his own family, but God had a purpose. And I believe strongly God has a purpose for this church. I may never know what it is until, why we went through those hard times. But I'm sure all churches, big and small, go through very difficult times and have their own challenges.
They do. The big ones, some of the challenges are mind-boggling.
Yeah.
How difficult. They're not as evident publicly, but
So,
nonetheless.
Yeah,
great
He
difficulty.
doesn't want us to walk away. It's persevere, trust, and keep serving.
Well, you are one of 2 or 3 key people that kept this church afloat during those first several months that Terry and I were here. And so I want people to understand that talk about somebody who never wanted to draw any attention to herself, and that was Sherry. But she did what needed to be done, and she said, we are not giving this up. And, God's been with us through all this time, and He's going to be with this church long into the future, far beyond when you and I are around.
Yes, I hope so, and I trust that will be so. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your insight and your sharing with us. This timing is coming in just about right here. I have to keep these interviews and the podcast that I make under 30 minutes. If it's 29 minutes and 59 seconds, I can upload them for free. If it's 30 minutes, I have to pay. And so we're going to be frugal. But I appreciate not only just you sharing this with us, but also just giving us some historical overview. And I wanted people to hear what Sherry's heart is like. During the time when we weren't having open public services here, Sherry took on some projects around the building, just painting things and just some sprucing up, and all of those things show a level of care. And that means something, because when people visit and they see a building that's well taken care of, that means something. And I think it means something even more to younger families. The millennial generation seems to be more attuned to that than perhaps our generation was. In any case, thank you so much. And as a fellow organist, we understand something that most people don't understand. Although Sherry is one of the barefoot organists. She takes her shoes off and she plays the pedals just in her stocking feet. I've never quite been able to do that. But that being said, that's not exactly a doctrinal difference, so we won't worry about that. Thank you so much, Sherry. Appreciate your time today, and just thank you again for all you do.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege.
I want to give a special thank you to Sherry and to Doug for all their years of faithful service here and for the years yet to come. Sometimes that's what we have to do, is as things change, and they will change, that we stay with it because our eyes are on God and we're more concerned about Him than we are about ourselves. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for your faithful service to Calvary Baptist Church. Take care, and God bless you all.